Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. So this interview is divided into two parts. In the first part, we looked at the problems with blended finance and privatization. And in this part two, we look at alternatives. In particular, public banks and what these would look like in Canada and Quebec, how they're different from credit cooperatives, and what the Canadian government could be doing to help develop the public sector overseas. So along and related, that leads me to my next question, which is if you could tell us what you think blended finance is, and that can be very brief because of course this whole series has addressed that, but also more particularly, what are the alternatives to blending? Like what you're saying seems to say we don't need this. The public sector has a lot of capacity. So could you address that question?
I can go first this time if you want, Tom. I mean, for me, blended finance is basically just another way of saying some kind of public-private partnership. And the language is always strategically chosen. Partnership sounds positive. It sounds like there's a sharing going on. It sounds like there's a long-term agreement on objectives and so on. Similarly, blended finance sounds like there's something where there's a mutual agreement on equal terms. But essentially what it is state entities offering subsidies to private finance to try and get them to contribute, but they're not contributing in any sense of doing anything beyond making a profit. And so, just again, by definition, a private company is there to, at the very least, break even and, ultimately make money. And so they're not going to get involved in any kind of project unless there's a profit there. And if it involves funding for low-income households and infrastructure, then it's going to require significant subsidies. And you see terms like comfort and support for private finance. So here we have the most profitable and aggressive sector in the world today, getting subsidies from the state to do things that the state could and should be doing themselves at a much lower price. So for me, it's the whole thing is essentially a cover-up to say that we want to bring the private sector in, offer them subsidies to do things that we can and should be doing.
I would largely agree in the blending agenda, where the explicit purpose is about using public money and finance to leverage or draw in private investors that would not otherwise happen, or what they believe would not otherwise come in. And this is a fraught process, and it is very much, it's just another form of public-private partnerships bent to the needs of the private and almost never to the public. And so, I agree. I think this is a highly problematic process. I would distinguish, and where I would distinguish myself or suggest that there is a difference, is that not all relationships, like what I was just beginning to discuss earlier, that where you have public banks that are relatively strong institutions who draw significant resources from private finance is something different than blending per se. So to give you an example, and these are really, in terms of bonds, which is something different than blending, but can often be confused between them. The KfW, the German KfW, gets almost all of its financial resources from private financial markets, as do a number of other investment banks, even public commercial banks, and so on. Nordic Investment Bank, probably, I don't know what they are, what the exact numbers are, but it'd be significant. But also, you would even think, even in the case of whether public retail commercial banks that take just deposits from the public, they're actually drawing in private finance in a sense and then using those as well. So it's not the blending agenda. But I do see, I'm an advocate of public banks drawing in private finance as a strategy of definancialization, because they're pulling in otherwise hypermobile and very profit-oriented finance into a public institution, and in a sense sterilizing it, or transforming it, or can transform it. They don't necessarily do, but they can transform it into water infrastructure, into investments in a particular community. They fix that money that is globally mobile in a particular sphere. This was the logic of the Bank of North Dakota, for example, that was established in 1919 as, really it's the only public bank, not the only public bank, there's a North American Development Bank, but really the only sort of local public bank in the United States, established by a very leftist, very socialist party that came into power, the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota at that time, in response to foreign bankers within the sphere of the United States, sort of really being hyper extractive out of the farmers in North Dakota. And their response was to create this bank to fix otherwise global, or within the United States, flows of capital within the borders of North Dakota, slow it, fix it, direct it, and so on. And so they changed the nature of that flow of finance capital. And that is a fairly strong characteristic of most public banks around the world that are drawing on financial markets. I see that actually as a positive, because they're drawing in and slowing otherwise quite destructive flows of capital. But it is different. This is not necessarily the blending agenda. And I want to distinguish that the blending agenda is about bending public money to private needs, much as David explained. What I would distinguish as definancialization is using public financial institutions to pull in otherwise mobile private flows of finance, and public, it can also be public actually as well, clearly, and then orient that according to a public purpose, give it a reason, a direction, and so on. I don't know, have I made myself clear in this? Because I think it's actually an important distinction.
I'm wondering on that note then, and I know you both have looked into this, if you could comment on the institutions that Canadian state government, the Liberal government, but also before that, have created, which would include the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Also, there's a new development finance institution called FinDev. Could you comment on what you think those institutions are about with respect to this conversation?
Yeah, I'll leave that to David for sure, because I haven't done my homework as much as I should. Just for the audiences to know, I'm located in Europe actually. I teach in UK, live in mainland Europe. That's sort of my sphere of thought right now. Not entirely, but yeah, I haven't done my homework on the new Canadian institutions so much.
I'll just pick up actually on something Tom was saying, which I fundamentally agree with as well. And I've just come up with this term, and maybe others have used it, but I think what you've described there, Tom, is harnessing private capital. Sort of bending private capital to a broader public will. That is not the objective or the practice of blended finance. Blended finance is the opposite way around. It's private capital bending the will of the public to what's what it wants. So I think harnessing private capital, both in practical terms, because it's going to be with us for a long time, and I think philosophically for me, do we want every single thing in under state control? Probably not. So having private capital out there that can make decisions and be creative in ways that go beyond the conventional institutionalized state is a very positive thing. But because of the power of private finance capital, the imbalance is huge. And so, I think certainly the practice, and I think if not intentionally, at least unwittingly, the philosophy of blended finance is to find ways for private finance to penetrate into the public sector in highly subsidized ways. And and I'm not sure that all government officials and NGO people and so on recognize this. I think that there is, a belief that there's some positive things going on. But even empirically, we don't see it happen. In the same way that I mentioned earlier, private finance is not investing at scale in basic infrastructure. Even with all of these, comforts and subsidies with blended finance, it's still not happening. I can speak to that with some authority in the water sector. We just, blended finance that the World Bank has been pushing for the last 10 years or so has made virtually no difference to private sector investment in what is arguably the most essential service infrastructure in the world. So it's both practically problematic and philosophically problematic, and for a variety of reasons. And I think ultimately we also need to talk about our public pension funds in this country. But for a variety of reasons, we've been convinced in Canada that blended finance is a good thing. And Global Affairs Canada, Canadian Infrastructure Bank have bought into this agenda. And in fact, we're amongst the most aggressive promoters of this notion of blended finance in the world. It's largely private capital, but increasingly, maybe I'll just bring it up now, it's public pension funds that are, essentially financial agencies aggressively seeking locations to invest in the long term. They're looking at 30, 40, 50-year time horizons, not, 3 or 5 months, but so it does change. It is more patient capital, which is something Tom's working on. But they're very, very, very powerful organizations, and they're particularly powerful in Canada. But they're also, they punch above their weight, if you will, on the global scale in terms of promoting this whole blended financing model, and investing in infrastructure as an asset class for public pension funds. And so, there's quite a robust movement globally on public pension funds and sovereign wealth funds investing in basic infrastructure like roads and airports and so on. And Canadian public pension funds are at the forefront of this, pushing very, very aggressively to invest. And they'll always use the F word, which is their fiduciary responsibility to do the best thing for their pension holders. But they are aggressively promoting this whole blended finance model.
Okay, so I'm wondering if you can tell us then a little bit more about public banks, and in particular, what they would look like in Canada and Quebec. And of course, you both have co-authored a great piece in The Conversation that was published, I think, in February, well, a couple of days ago, which talks about COVID context and why public banks are so important. But could you maybe give us some examples to help us understand what a public bank is, and also how they differ from credit cooperatives, which is probably what people often think a public bank means?
Tom, you want to take that?
Sure. So I define public banks not simply on ownership, like being predominantly owned by a government or state authority. That is one way. I think it certainly can be. But it also might include things like a bank that is legally constituted and governed under public law according to some public mandate or purpose. So there's different ways that a bank can be sort of, in a sense, located within the public sphere. It can be by ownership or by effective legal control. So in some cases, as in there's one example, it sort of doesn't fit the box, is Banco Popular in Costa Rica, it's a worker-owned and controlled bank. So in a sense, it's a cooperative bank that is 100% in law, public law, quote unquote, owned by the working class of Costa Rica. But it has, it's connected to government policy. Its board, its national governing board, has 3 government ministers appointed to it, alongside 4 members from the Workers' Assembly, which is actually the highest governing board of the bank. But that's a public bank, in a sense, right? Even though it's actually not owned by a government or a public authority. Or at least I would argue it is. And people within the bank also call it a public bank, and other people say it's a private bank within. So it's a bit one of those crazy beasts. But the more common one is that the government owns the bank one way or another, and it will have some form of public interest mandate. And there are different types of public banks. I've mentioned there are commercial retail ones. Those are the kind of like Desjardins, where you go and you have a checking account and you put savings in it, you get a mortgage or insurance, things like that. Those are less common in North America and less common in Europe. But there's also development banks, which are more investment type banks, where they deal in large scale infrastructure, bigger projects, target areas like SMEs or farmers or things like that. And you can't go into and deposit money per se, or get a checking account, but you might be able to go, your municipality might go there and get a loan to improve water or to install electric buses if you're so lucky. And then in the global south, there's other mixes. They're called universal banks, although they do exist in the US, public universal banks, where they do have deposit taking, insurance services, and investment and development projects. So the Banco Popular in Costa Rica is a universal bank. It does both. Really the distinguishing feature there is that these banks they're typically owned and or controlled in one way by public authorities, where the board ought to have some sort of public interest orientation to it. In practice, that's not always the case. There are lots of public banks that have been corporatized and made to function as if they were private profit-seeking banks, and these are the kind of banks that you need to reclaim. These are the struggles that need to be had. And for example, the Alberta Treasury branch, which is the largest public bank, public commercial bank, like retail bank in North America, in the 1980s was essentially corporatized by Ralph Klein, and was given a mandate to be profit maximizing. So its operations have very little sort of connection to any real public ethos. It gives a few grants, a few community things, and so on, but it's not, other than the presence it maintains in smaller communities, which is not an unimportant service. There's not much different to it. I don't know if I'm the one to speak to what is difference between a cooperative bank per se. Because I'm not a specialist per se in cooperative banks, but cooperative banks, sort of what I was talking about, like the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, they are private banks in a sense. They're privately owned and operated, though typically, but not always, again, they will tend to have some kind of a community mandate or a mandate tied to their membership. They can be commanded in ways different, or in ways that they can mediate their profit imperatives. They still need to drive a profit. And I guess this is the point I should have made earlier, is that one thing that can potentially fundamentally distinguish a public bank from all other banks, cooperative or any other private bank, is that there is no structural need for a public bank to ever turn a profit. That is a political decision if it is to be a profit-seeking bank. There are examples of public banks that turn huge profits, very profitable because they've been mandated to do so. There are examples of public banks that have a mandate to be financially sustainable, meaning that they ought not to make a loss through their own operations, through their own books, right? So those ones will often operate at very small margins of like 0.3 return on assets. So like the KFW has very low return on assets, but it's a very successful bank in a sense. It operates according to different logics. But equally too, they can lose money hand over fist if they're backed by the government and those losses are covered. If those losses are intended to serve a public purpose and that doesn't undermine or destroy the public bank, that is equally fine. By injecting public capital into it, the bank in essence remains sustainable. So for example, again, just because this is also the chapter I wrote in the book on public banks and COVID-19 with David, or we didn't write it, we co-edited it. One of the chapters I contributed was on KfW. It's lost, over 600 million euros in the first half of 2020, and that's not going to undermine the long-term sustainability of the bank at all. In fact, it bolsters its public credibility. A cooperative bank would have a very hard time, if it goes into loss-making territory, its members are either going to have to inject capital or it gets sold off. And the trajectory has typically been that it's sold off or they draw in private investors and it becomes corporatized, and like any other private bank, it becomes privatized. So that would be sort of my, let's say, position on that.
Maybe, Susan, I could use an analogy, and Tom can correct me if I've strayed too far here, but because most Canadians, myself included, before I started working with Tom on this, my public banks, what the heck is that? So it's been a learning curve for me. But so let me use the analogy, something we're a little more familiar with in the Canadian context, around community-owned renewable energy projects. And we've seen quite a few of these, particularly with solar and to some extent wind initiatives. So they are private entities in that they're owned by a limited number of people, but they can be public in the sense that they're interested in the broader public good. Maybe they have elections, etc. So at some point it can get a little blurry. And if you look at some of the big energy co-ops in Europe, for example, there's one co-op that services over 500,000 people. It's at the level of a city, and so is that a government or is that separate? So there is a kind of scalar nature to some of these things. And I think the same was true with some of the co-op banks. They're quite big, and they have sort of public characteristics. But for me, what fundamentally separates these things is that they are ultimately standalone. They are not legally or institutionally connected up with this broader political decision-making framework. And it gets back to the earlier part of our discussion around holistic decision-making. And I think what fundamentally distinguishes something as public is that it thinks beyond its immediate institutional and financial and managerial confines. And so if you have an energy co-op or a small bank co-op, they are by definition restricted to thinking about themselves. And that can be quite progressive, but it's, you can't then harness that and link it up to broader public initiatives around, what is our overall goal with green energy. And so, to use the analogy in Ontario, we have effectively handed over 100% of our renewable energy in Ontario is either owned by private for-profit organizations or private co-op organizations. And that's why it's just such a disaster. It's fragmented, there's very little coordination, there's bickering within communities, across communities. There's no integrated plan for what public renewable energy will look like in this province. Germany has similar problems, but they've got much bigger public oversight, much bigger public investment in renewable energy, as they have with public banks. So for me, it's, if something isn't truly public, if it's ultimately completely disassociated with all other public decision making. And I think that's ultimately what happens with a co-op. Is it is ultimately a private entity.
And I think a lot of people in the US and in Europe have been promoting public banks as a way as well to address some of what you're saying, David, in terms of the Green New Deal or Green New Deal proposals, which of course aren't as strong in Canada right now, but there are some social movements and organizers who are certainly interested in pushing this kind of coherent politics to have an a just energy transition, which is also needs at some level to be orchestrated and coordinated by the state.
Mm-hmm. And let me just, in case it came across incorrectly, I'm not saying that you can't have small, effective public agencies like public banks. And there's, Tom, we can speak more of this. I mean, you get municipal level public banks that are incredibly effective and they're integrated into their community and so on, right? But they're also networked in with other public banks. And you look at the sort of, public banking associations in different parts of the world, they communicate with each other, they share best practices, they, there's a broader public mission. Maybe they're integrated up with the regional level government to the national level government, right? So you can have really small, effective public agencies like public banks and so on. But it's that integration into the larger public whole, which I think fundamentally distinguishes how they operate. Now, they can be rotten through to the core and still be integrated. So, then there's the question of, are they good public service providers? But it's that integration into, a broader network of public institutions and public networks that I think fundamentally distinguishes a public entity.
Well, I suppose one of the main points that you made in the beginning, both of you, is that it's about cooperation and collaboration rather than competition in terms of public interest and the public good. So the last question I have for both of you is, what do you think the Canadian government should be doing to actually promote and strengthen the public sector capacity overseas in terms of an alternative to blended finance, which you said earlier, both of you, one of the issues we have is the undermining or the hollowing out of this capacity with this bending public finance towards private interest?
Well, I think the first thing they can do is stop what they're doing. And that would be the most effective thing. The Canadian government is really sort of years behind the curve, and it's become more neoliberal as other governments have started to question some of those neoliberal orthodoxies. So I think we need to stop doing what we're doing and either build capacity amongst Canadian organizations, NGOs, public sector unions, et cetera, that have that kind of pro-public, public networking experience and pedagogy and training and so on, and advance that kind of stuff. And you see it. You've got amazing people in the public healthcare system, in all kinds of public services and our public sector trade unions and so on. There's huge capacity there. So taking it away from these Global Affairs Canada and handing it over to more truly publicly oriented organizations. Now, of course, that ain't going to happen, and it certainly isn't going to happen right away. But I think realistically, is organizations like that challenging what Global Affairs Canada broadly is doing, and demanding and insisting on a scaling back of this neoliberal agenda and promoting, at the very least, a more diversified, more balanced approach to building and promoting public sector capacity in countries around the world. Because we certainly have lots, we certainly have a lot of lessons, a lot of things that we have to offer, but we have a lot to learn. And I think that's my last point, I guess, would be that, rather than us telling other people what to do, it needs to be a bilateral, iterative learning process. And, so what do we have to learn from other places? Certainly on the public banking front, we have a lot to learn, but public healthcare, public electricity, public transportation, et cetera, Canadian institutions have an enormous amount to learn and offer in the spirit of public solidarity.
Yeah, I agree with everything David's been saying. I mean, certainly on the financial front, you know, you have to get away from all these tied aid and blending, and it be about, you know, building up the private sector per se, and really, I think probably targeted more towards grants for one, and writing off existing debts and you know, illegitimate debts, and you know, writing some of the colonial legacies and so on, would be a good starting point. And then certainly in terms of, you know, future loans, highly subsidized, you know, if it is to be a loan, highly subsidized and so on. But really, it's the idea is to build capacity, lasting, sustainable capacity, and you know, do that by, you know, helping to support existing movements in a sort of co-creation, you know, collaborative way, non-competitive, you know, projects, you know, that aren't essentially about, I don't know, picking winners among the largest corporations in the smallest, poorest countries and so on. And, you know, and then, you know, the Canadian government could certainly do a lot there around supporting unions and unionization and solidarity, which they haven't necessarily been the best on that in the past, that's for sure. But yeah, I mean, these are things that the Liberal government is really hasn't been sort of at the forefront of. But civil society can be. Screw the Liberals.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think you really do lay out an agenda, and a very coherent one, in terms of what would actually create a better world, and not in the sense of building back better, which is more of the same, but actual system transformation to rebuild public institutions that have the public interest at heart. And when I say the public interest, I mean working classes, communities, in terms of just transition to address these crises, these multiple crises that we find ourselves in. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Great initiative.
Thanks, Susan.